It's interesting what's there and what isn't there. It's interesting that every knee will bow, but if you've watched enough movies, you know that when the conquering sovereign comes in, every knee does bow, and those that are a little slow about bowing get knocked down by the guards and get on your knees. This is the appropriate idea. And that every tongue will confess. What do they confess? What's interesting is what we don't see there that Paul likes to say about Jesus. He is Lord and Savior. What we don't see is that. What they confess is Jesus is Lord. Yep, he sure is, whether I like it or not. So I don't see that as giving much comfort to my Universalist friends. Because one day the evidence for Jesus' Lordship, his power, his might, his supremacy will be unmistakable. But I don't see anything in that verse that says everyone's going to like it.
Yeah, it's interesting in that verse, the word acknowledge in the original language means, in every other use in the New Testament and in the Old Testament in the Septuagint, means to profess wholeheartedly, voluntarily, to praise. So it's that every tongue will praise Jesus. That's really what it's talking about. And if it's to the glory of God, it's got to be done freely. Because if you don't do something freely, then God is a loser. I mean, it would be to God's shame to have people like in the ancient Roman world. That, in fact, most of the time when I've heard that explained by people that believe in eternal conscious punishment, they'll say, well, it's God forcing the enemies to cower at his feet. I think that's to God's shame. He can't win their heart. Here, the God of the universe, who created all things, who's all loving and all good, he has to submit himself to punishing, just brute force to accomplish something. That's to God's shame. That's not to the glory of God. So no, God brings that. It's to God's glory. It's freely given and wholeheartedly given, and that's what God will do at the end of time. Every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the seas will all proclaim voluntarily, freely, and wholeheartedly that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
So I think that the mistake that both Universalists and some other Christians make is to think that what Paul is doing is predicting or matter-of-factly stating that every knee will bow and that every tongue will confess. And I think that's an artifact of the translational difficulties. English is not quite the same kind of language as Greek or Hebrew, and that's important because Paul is not coming up with all of that language on his own. He's also quoting the Old Testament in Isaiah 45, I think it is. And in the Greek, the verbs for confess and bow are subjunctives, which doesn't necessarily mean that Paul isn't predicting, but it does mean he could be doing something else. And in fact, if you look at the Old Testament passage that he is quoting when he says every knee will bow and every tongue confess, it's the same kind of Hebrew verbal forms that are used in the Ten Commandments. When God says, you shall not murder, he isn't saying you will not murder, as in, you matter-of-factly will not murder. No, quite the contrary. We know that Israel disobeyed many of those commandments, all of them. What he is saying is that you ought not murder. You must not murder. And the same appears to be the case in the context of both Isaiah 45, where Paul is quoting, if my memory serves me there, and the context of Philippians 2. It isn't that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. It's that God has given Christ the name above all names so that it will be to him that everybody is obligated to bow. It will be his name everybody is obligated to confess. It's a statement of oughtness, not an indicative statement of what will happen. So it would be better to say so that every knee shall or ought bow, and every tongue must confess the name of Christ. There's just nothing there, as far as I can tell, to substantiate the idea that it is a statement about what will happen. And by the way, I said it's not just Universalists who make that mistake, and obviously it's my opinion that it's a mistake, but it's also some believers in eternal torment and conditionalism. So for example, some conditionalists have said, well, yeah, when all other knees have been destroyed, the only knees who remain will be bowing, right? And yeah, I get that. I've made that argument myself, but I think that misunderstands the nature of what Paul's doing there. Same thing with believers in eternal torment. Many of them think that, yeah, sure, every knee will in fact bow, and every name and every tongue confess, but begrudgingly, right? Like as part of, recognition of their just punishment. But again, that's not what Paul's doing. It's not what Isaiah was doing. This is a statement about oughtness and obligation, not a statement about what will in fact happen.